At 9 o'clock on February 19, 1945, the beach at Iwo Jima was already killing men. Black volcanic sand swallowed boots with every step. Mortar rounds burst without warning. Machine gun fire came from nowhere and everywhere. The Japanese had buried themselves into the island, turning 8 square miles of rock into a maze of tunnels, bunkers, and firing slits that Marines could not see until they were already being cut down. Men from the 5th Marine Division lay flat in shallow depressions, pinned so tightly that standing up for even a second meant death. Tanks were stuck in the ash. Naval gunfire was useless against targets that refused to reveal themselves. Momentum, the single thing an assault needed, was already gone. Near the center of the beach, one Marine rose to a crouch. He was holding a weapon that had never been meant for this fight, a gun built from aircraft parts, a gun his own sergeant had once called a stupid idea, no stock approved by the armory, no doctrine, no guarantee it would even survive its first burst. Around him, Marines were dying because they couldn't see who was killing them. So Corporal Tony Stein did something that made no sense at all. He stood up, fully upright, in the middle of a killing ground and waited for the enemy to shoot at him. If this weapon was going to work, it would have to work now. The problem on Iwo Jima wasn't courage, it wasn't numbers, it wasn't even firepower, it was movement. American doctrine relied on momentum, riflemen advancing behind suppressive fire, closing distance before the enemy could recover. But on this beach, that system was breaking down minute by minute. The standard Browning M1919 machine gun was powerful and reliable, but it weighed over 30 pounds before ammunition. It was built for defense, not assault. Crews had to stop, set it up, fire, then break it down again before moving forward. Each time they did, the attack stalled. Each pause gave the Japanese time to shift positions through their tunnel networks and reopen fire from somewhere new. On Iwo Jima, stopping meant dying. The enemy understood this perfectly. Japanese machine guns were hidden behind volcanic rock, sandbags, and concrete, their fields of fire overlapping so completely that a Marine who stood up was immediately engaged by multiple positions. Mortars zeroed in on movement. Snipers waited for silhouettes. Tanks were supposed to break the deadlock. Instead, they sank into the ash, throwing tracks or bogging down within yards of the beach. Naval gunfire couldn't hit what it couldn't see. Airstrikes overshot or missed entirely. The Marines needed something that could move with the riflemen, something that could pour overwhelming fire into a position the instant it revealed itself, and keep firing while advancing. They didn't have it. Except, unknown to almost everyone on that beach, one Marine was carrying a weapon built specifically to solve a problem the manuals had never imagined. Tony Stein was not thinking about heroism when he landed on Iwo Jima. He was thinking the same way he had always thought, in measurements, tolerances, and limits. Stein grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the son of Austrian Jewish immigrants who had fled Europe to escape rising anti-Semitism. He left school early and went to work as a toolmaker, spending long hours at a lathe, learning how metal behaved under stress, how much force it could take before it bent, how much before it failed. That way of thinking never left him. When Stein joined the Marine Corps in 1942, he didn't arrive as a natural warrior. He arrived as a man who noticed problems. On Bougainville, he learned what combat actually looked like. Not clean advances, not neat lines, but confusion, hidden enemies, and equipment pushed far beyond what it was designed to do. He watched machine gun teams fall behind advancing riflemen. He saw assaults lose momentum because weapons that were devastating from fixed positions became liabilities the moment the fight moved forward. Most Marines accepted that as reality. Stein didn't. During the Bougainville campaign, his mechanical instincts drew attention. He wasn't just effective in combat, he modified gear, adjusted mounts, fixed things that weren't supposed to be fixed in the field. That habit caught the eye of another Marine with similar instincts, Sergeant Mel Grevich. Grevich had salvaged something unusual from a wrecked aircraft, an AN/M 2.30 caliber machine gun designed for aerial combat, not ground fighting. It was lighter than standard infantry machine guns, and it fired at a rate that bordered on uncontrollable. Most men looked at it and saw a dead end. Tony Stein saw a solution waiting to be built. The AN/M2 aircraft machine gun was never meant to be carried by a single man. It had been designed for bombers and fighters, mounted in flexible positions, cooled by slipstream at hundreds of miles per hour. It weighed roughly 10 pounds less than the standard infantry machine gun, but it came with no stock, no sights, and no way to fire it accurately while moving on foot. Most Marines who saw it dismissed it immediately. Tony Stein didn't. Working after hours in a maintenance shed in Hawaii, Stein and Mel Grevich began to experiment. There were no blueprints, no approval from higher command, just salvaged parts and trial and error. Stein cut down the wooden stock of an M1 Garand and hollowed it out by hand, shaping it to fit the aircraft gun's buffer tube. He fabricated a crude trigger mechanism from sheet metal scraps. A Browning automatic rifle bipod was welded to the front to give the weapon some stability. Improvised sights were added, just enough to aim. The result was ugly, unofficial, unforgiving. Fed by a 100-round ammunition box, the gun could empty its entire load in seconds. Its rate of fire was so high that control came not from finesse but discipline, short bursts, precise timing. Other Marines laughed. Some called it brilliant, others called it a death trap. One sergeant said the barrel would melt, another said it would jam instantly. Then Stein test-fired it on the range. In under 6 seconds, he erased a target at 200 yards. The laughter stopped. The weapon was approved. Quietly, 6 were built. They called it the Stinger, and now one of them was about to be used on the black sand of Iwo Jima. Tony Stein did not advance at first. He stood still. On the open beach with Japanese machine guns raking the sand, Stein rose to his feet and exposed himself deliberately. Bullets snapped past his head. Volcanic ash kicked up around his boots. Mortar rounds walked closer. He wasn't being reckless. He was solving a problem. Hidden positions could not be destroyed until they revealed themselves, and nothing made a hidden gunner fire faster than a Marine standing upright in the open. Moments later, Stein saw it, a brief muzzle flash, barely visible through drifting smoke and black sand. A pillbox 75 yards away, camouflaged so well it had already killed men who never saw it. Stein brought the Stinger up to his shoulder and squeezed the trigger. The weapon exploded to life. The sound was unlike anything else on the beach, a tearing, continuous roar as .30 caliber rounds poured out at a rate no infantry weapon could match. In seconds, volcanic rocks shattered, sandbags disintegrated. The firing slit vanished under the sheer volume of impacts. The Japanese machine gun went silent. Stein shifted left, already scanning for the next flash. Another burst, another position suppressed. Marines around him began to move, almost instinctively, rising from the sand and advancing behind the noise and chaos the Stinger created. For the first time since the landing, Company A was moving forward instead of hugging the ground. Stein didn't pause to watch. The Stinger suddenly felt lighter in his hands. The ammunition box was empty. 100 rounds, gone in seconds. The weapon worked. That much was clear. But as Stein looked back toward the beach, 200 yards of open ground stretched between him and the next box of ammunition, and the enemy had already noticed exactly who was carrying the gun. The Stinger had done exactly what Tony Stein built it to do. It crushed hidden positions with speed and violence no infantry weapon could match. It forced the enemy to go silent long enough for Marines to move. It turned invisible fire into something tangible, something that could be attacked, but it came with a cost that revealed itself almost immediately. The Stinger was hungry. At over 1,000 rounds per minute, a full 100-round ammunition box vanished in seconds. 5 seconds of sustained fire, sometimes less. Each burst that shattered a pillbox also drained the weapon dry. Stein had known this in theory. He had timed it on. The range in Hawaii. He had warned his officers. Experiencing it on Iwo Jima was different. The moment the gun fell silent, the battlefield seemed to inhale. Japanese positions that had gone quiet began to stir again. Marines who had risen to advance hesitated, suddenly exposed without covering fire. Stein turned and looked back toward the beach. 200 yards of open volcanic sand swept by mortars, machine guns, and snipers. No cover, no protection, just distance and time. The ammunition resupply point was near the waterline, where landing craft were still unloading under intermittent fire. Marines moving back and forth were already being targeted. Several had been hit trying to do exactly what Stein now needed to do. If the Stinger was going to keep Company A moving, ammunition had to keep reaching it. There was no one else to do it. Stein tightened the sling across his shoulder, took a last look at the ground ahead, and started running. Every step sank into the loose ash. It wasn't like normal sand. Marines would later describe it as running through ball bearings, unstable, exhausting, unforgiving. Behind him, Japanese gunners began to adjust their fire. Ahead of him, the only thing that mattered was reaching the beach and getting back alive. The weapon could dominate the battlefield, but only if Stein was willing to cross it again and again to feed it. Tony Stein reached the waterline out of breath and covered in black ash. Landing craft were still grinding onto the beach, their ramps dropping as men and supplies poured out under sporadic mortar fire. Corpsmen worked in shallow craters, treating wounded where they fell. Ammunition boxes were stacked haphazardly near the surf, already half buried in volcanic sand. Stein didn't slow down. He grabbed a wounded Marine on the way in, shrapnel in the leg, conscious but unable to walk, hoisted him onto his shoulder, and carried him the last yards to a corpsman. Only then did he turn to the ammunition. 4 boxes of linked .30 caliber rounds, 100 rounds each. Heavy, awkward, cutting into his hands and shoulders. He took 2 in his pack and 1 in each hand, then turned back toward the fight. The return run was worse. Japanese snipers had begun watching the beach. Bullets snapped into the sand around his boots, kicking up black plumes inches from his legs. A mortar round detonated nearby, showering him with volcanic rock. Stein kept running, leaning forward into the slope, forcing his legs to keep moving. When he reached Company A's position, the Marines were still pinned. Stein dropped the boxes, slammed a fresh belt into the Stinger, and rose again. The gun roared. Another pillbox went silent. Within seconds, the ammunition was gone. Stein didn't wait for orders. He turned and ran back toward the beach. Halfway down, he passed another wounded Marine, chest wound, struggling to breathe. Stein stopped, lifted him, and ran the rest of the way carrying both the man and the weight of the Stinger on his shoulder. Then, he did it again, and again. Each trip followed the same brutal rhythm: suppress, advance, empty gun, run, carry a wounded Marine down, carry ammunition back up. The distance never changed, 200 yards each way. The danger never eased. If anything, it increased as Japanese gunners began to realize that one barefoot-looking Marine kept reappearing in the same stretch of open ground. By late morning, Stein had already made multiple runs under fire. His lungs burned, his legs trembled. His hands were raw from carrying metal boxes through abrasive ash. But Company A was no longer stuck on the beach. Every time the Stinger came back to life, the line moved forward again. And as Stein started yet another run toward the water, the volcanic sand grinding into his boots, he began to realize something was going to have to change, or his body wouldn't last the day. But late morning, Tony Stein's boots were coming apart. The volcanic ash was nothing like the sand from training beaches. It was sharp, loose, and abrasive, grinding its way into leather and seams with every step. The soles of Stein's boots were peeling away. The leather had cracked open, rubbing raw skin beneath. Every run to the beach cost him speed and pain. Speed was the only thing keeping him alive. Stein stopped briefly behind what little cover the terrain offered and looked down at his feet. The decision he made next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defiant. It was practical. The boots were slowing him down. He unlaced them and kicked them off into the black sand. Barefoot, he could feel the ground. The ash shifted under his feet, but without stiff soles fighting the terrain, he could adjust his stride, dig in, and move faster. It hurt immediately. The sand was coarse, like running on broken glass, but it was faster. He took the decision further. Stein removed his helmet, another few pounds gone, not much on paper, but in a fight measured in seconds, weight mattered. Every ounce shaved meant another yard covered before the next mortar round landed. He stood, barefoot and bareheaded, slung the Stinger across his shoulder, and ran. The pain was constant now. The ash tore at his skin. Small cuts opened with every step. But Stein reached the beach quicker than before. He grabbed ammunition. He lifted another wounded Marine. He ran back again. Those watching from Company A noticed it immediately. The same Marine making the same deadly run, again and again, now without boots, moving faster than before. Some thought he was insane. Stein wasn't thinking about bravery or fear or how it looked. He was thinking about distance, time, weight. The mathematics were simple. If he could move faster, more Marines would live. And so, barefoot and bleeding, Tony Stein turned back toward the fire and ran once more into the open. By early afternoon, the Stinger was beginning to fail. It had never been built for this kind of fight. In the air, the AN/M2 was cooled by rushing wind, fired in short bursts as aircraft closed and broke away. On Iwo Jima, there was no airflow, only heat. Burst after burst turned the thin aircraft barrel a dark, burned purple. The weapon was degrading in Stein's hands. The barrel warped slightly. The improvised trigger began to stick. Sometimes it fired longer than he wanted. Sometimes it hesitated when he needed it most. Between bursts, Stein slapped the side of the receiver to reset it, coaxing the gun back into action like a machine on borrowed time. Yet, even damaged, it still worked. Each time a Japanese position opened fire, Stein answered with overwhelming volume. When the Stinger roared, adjacent pillboxes hesitated. Riflemen recognized the sound instantly. When the gun fired, they moved. When it went silent, they dropped flat. The coordination required no orders. The enemy noticed too. Japanese snipers began to hunt Stein specifically. Bullets snapped closer now, deliberately aimed. On one run back from the beach, a round cracked past his head close enough that he felt the air move. Stein dropped into the ash, pinned for the first time that day. He didn't crawl away. Stein read the angle of the shot and understood the geometry immediately. The sniper was elevated, likely dug into volcanic rock 200 yards away. Running back toward his own lines would keep him in the rifle's sight picture longer. So Stein did the opposite. He rose and sprinted directly toward the sniper. The sudden movement threw off the aim. Shots missed. At closer range, Stein spotted the faint movement of a spider hole and dropped to one knee. The Stinger erupted, chewing through rock and sand in a violent blur. When the ammunition box ran dry, the firing had stopped. Stein reloaded and advanced carefully. The sniper was dead. There was no time to reflect. Ahead of Company A, the battlefield tightened into something worse. A defensive arc of pillboxes and trenches arranged to kill any Marine who stood up. Other companies had stalled here. Casualties were mounting. The Stinger was battered. Stein's feet were torn and bleeding. His body was beginning to fail. But as he looked at the line ahead, one thing was still true. As long as the gun fired, the Marines could move. And Tony Stein was not finished running yet. Ahead of Company A, the ground rose slightly and the enemy fire intensified. The Japanese had built a defensive arc, pillboxes arranged in a shallow semicircle, each one covering the others. Machine guns overlapped, rifle fire stitched the ash. Any Marine who tried to stand was immediately engaged from multiple directions. 2 earlier assaults had already failed here. Dead Marines lay in front of the positions, motionless in the black sand. Tony Stein moved forward to the edge of the line and studied the arc. He didn't see a single target. He saw a system. If one position fired, he could silence it. If 2 fired, he could force both to hesitate. If he could keep them quiet long enough, just seconds at a time, the rifleman could close the distance. Stein rose into the open and fired. The Stinger hammered the leftmost pillbox. 5 seconds. The position went silent. Stein shifted his aim to the next firing slit. Another burst. Silence again. Japanese soldiers in the connecting trenches began firing at him, trying to overwhelm him before he could move on. Bullets struck the ground around his bare feet. One round hit the Stinger's barrel with a sharp metallic crack, knocking the weapon from his hands and sending it skidding into the ash. For a moment, Stein was unarmed. Japanese gunners saw it immediately. Fire intensified, waiting for him to expose himself again. Stein ran. He sprinted into the open, zigzagging through incoming fire, reached the Stinger, and dragged it back behind. Cover. The belt feed was bent. A round had jammed halfway into the mechanism. Stein cleared it with his fingers, forced a fresh belt into place, and test-fired a short burst. The gun still worked. He stood again and emptied the box into the pillbox that had knocked the weapon from his hands. The position collapsed under the volume of fire. As Stein reloaded, Marines surged forward behind him, 50 yards, then another 50. Each time the Stinger fired, they moved. By early afternoon, the defensive arc was breaking apart. Some pillboxes were destroyed outright. Others were abandoned as their crews fled through tunnels deeper into the island. Company A pushed through. Stein dropped behind the line, breathing hard. His feet were slick with blood. The Stinger's barrel sagged slightly, warped by heat and impact. The improvised stock was charred black, but the ground ahead was open. The beach was finally behind them. And for the first time that day, the advance did not stop when the gun fell silent. By late afternoon, Company A had reached its objective. The advance that had begun stalled and bloody on the beach now sat several hundred yards inland, at the base of the island's rising ground. The cost was visible everywhere: shattered equipment, cratered ash, bodies still waiting to be moved. Tony Stein finally stopped running. His feet were torn open, bleeding from dozens of cuts filled with volcanic grit. Shrapnel wounds burned in his leg and lower back. His hands were blistered and raw from carrying ammunition boxes and gripping an overheated weapon hour after hour. Beside him in a shallow fighting hole lay the Stinger. It was barely recognizable as a weapon now. The barrel was discolored and slightly bent. The wooden stock was charred and cracked. The improvised trigger worked only when it felt like it. It was damaged, unreliable, almost finished, but even broken, it was still useful. As darkness fell, Japanese soldiers began probing. The Marine lines. Small groups slipped forward through shell holes and shallow trenches, testing for weak points. Each time movement appeared in the gloom, Stein brought the Stinger up and fired short, violent bursts. The sound alone stopped the infiltrators. One by one, the probing attacks faded away. Stein had been fighting for nearly 8 continuous hours. He had crossed the same stretch of open ground again and again under fire. He had carried wounded Marines on every return run. He had fired hundreds of rounds through a weapon never meant to survive a single day like this. Now, with night settling over Iwo Jima, Stein leaned back against the volcanic earth and tried to rest. The hardest fighting of his life was over. He had survived the day. What Stein could not know was that the cost of February 19th was not finished being collected, and that the day which defined his legend would not be the day that ended his war. Tony Stein was evacuated from Iwo Jima against his will. Corpsmen finally overruled him late on February 19th. His feet were badly torn and already infected with volcanic grit. Shrapnel fragments had lodged in his leg and back. Blood loss and exhaustion had pushed him close to collapse. He was loaded onto a landing craft and carried offshore to a hospital ship riding at anchor. For the first time since the invasion began, the sound of gunfire faded. On board, doctors worked quickly. Wounds were cleaned. Shrapnel was removed. Bandages were applied. Stein was told the same thing every badly wounded Marine was told. His war was over. He was scheduled to be transferred to a rear area hospital, possibly Hawaii, maybe the United States. The fighting on Iwo Jima would continue without him. Stein lay in his bunk and listened. Through the steel hull, he could still hear distant artillery, still feel the vibration of naval guns firing inland. And then the news reached the ship. His unit was being destroyed. Company A had moved north from the landing beaches and was now locked in brutal fighting elsewhere on the island. Casualties were heavy. Men Stein had trained with, run beside, carried out of the ash. They were dying. Stein didn't argue with the doctors. He didn't make speeches. He waited. Then, against orders, he left the hospital ship. No clearance, no paperwork, just a wounded Marine climbing down into a landing craft headed back toward the beach. No one stopped him. No one asked questions. By the time he stepped onto Iwo Jima again, Tony Stein no longer had the Stinger. It didn't matter. He found a supply dump, requisitioned a new pair of boots, and took an M1 Garand from the pile of rifles waiting for replacements. Then he started walking. 6 miles across volcanic ash and shattered ground, back toward the sound of the fighting and back to the men he refused to leave behind. On the morning of March 1st, 1945, Tony Stein was back on the line. 8 days had passed since the landing. 8 days of constant fighting that had reduced Company A to a fraction of its original strength. The men who remained were exhausted, hollowed out by combat that never seemed to end. Stein's wounds had not healed, his feet were still bandaged, shrapnel remained in his body. But he was walking, and that was enough. That morning, Company A was ordered to send out a reconnaissance patrol. 19 Marines, their task was simple and deadly. Move forward several hundred yards, identify Japanese positions that had been harassing the advance, and return with the information. No assault, no heroics. Stein was designated assistant patrol leader. The terrain ahead was perfect for an ambush. Volcanic ridges, ravines, rock formations riddled with spider holes and concealed firing positions. The patrol moved slowly, 20 yards at a time. Stop, listen, scan. At 7:45 a.m., they reached a ridgeline overlooking a shallow valley. Stein stepped forward to get a better look. At 7:52, a single rifle shot cracked across the volcanic rock. The bullet struck Tony Stein in the head. He fell instantly. There was no last stand, no final words, no chance to return fire at the shooter, hidden somewhere among the rocks. Corpsmen reached him within seconds. It didn't matter. Corporal Tony Stein was 23 years old when he died. The patrol completed its mission and withdrew under covering fire, carrying Stein's body back with them across the ash. The enemy position was later saturated with mortar fire, but whether the sniper was killed was never confirmed. Tony Stein had survived the most violent day of the invasion of Iwo Jima. He did not survive the quieter one that followed. None of the weapons survived. The 6 Stingers built before Iwo Jima were never catalogued, never preserved. Some were destroyed by enemy fire, others overheated beyond repair. A few vanished in the chaos that followed the battle, treated as damaged field modifications and discarded without record. There is no museum case holding Tony Stein's gun, no serial number, no artifact to point to. What remains is the story. After Stein's death, the battle for Iwo Jima continued for nearly a month. When the island was finally declared secure, almost 7,000 Americans were dead. Nearly all of the Japanese defenders had been killed. The volcanic ground that Stein had crossed barefoot became a vast cemetery. In May 1945, Stein's commanders submitted a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. Every level of command approved it. The citation described a Marine who deliberately exposed himself to enemy fire, who charged pillboxes alone, who made repeated runs across open ground under fire to evacuate wounded comrades and resupply his weapon. It mentioned the gun only once. A personally improvised aircraft-type weapon. The name Stinger never appeared in the official record. That name lived only in memory. On February 19, 1946, 1 year after the landing, Tony Stein's widow received the Medal of Honor on his behalf. He was 23 years old when he died, a toolmaker from Ohio who had taken salvaged aircraft parts and, for one day, changed the shape of a battlefield. No doctrine was rewritten because of him. No standard weapon replaced the Browning machine gun. But on Iwo Jima, when Marines were pinned down and momentum had vanished, improvisation mattered more than regulations. One man's understanding of weight, distance, and time mattered more than theory. The Stinger disappeared. Tony Stein did not. If this story is worth remembering, share your thoughts below. Many of the men who fought on Iwo Jima left behind no monuments, only moments that survived because someone chose not to forget them.